The morning fog clung to the windows of Clarence House as Camilla, Queen Consort of England, stood in her private quarters. She had just finished her tea when there was a knock at the door. A stern-faced official from the Royal Collection Trust entered, carrying a leather-bound ledger and wearing an expression that made her heart sink. The official explained that a routine audit had been ordered. It was standard procedure, he assured her, but something in his tone suggested otherwise. They needed to catalog certain items in her possession, pieces that had historical significance to the crown. Camilla felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the room. She had always been careful with royal property. Every painting, every piece of jewelry, every antique vase had been documented when she moved into Clarence House after marrying Charles. But now, looking at the official's serious face, she wondered if something had gone wrong. The audit began in the drawing room. 2 assistants accompanied the official, their white gloves pristine as they handled each item with precision. They photographed everything, cross-referenced numbers, and made notes in their tablets. Camilla watched from a corner, her hands clasped tightly together. Hours passed. The team moved from room to room with mechanical efficiency. They examined her jewelry box, the one that contained pieces given to her by Charles over the years. They studied the paintings on the walls, the silver tea service she used for private gatherings, even the books on her shelves. Then came the moment that changed everything. In a small storage room at the back of her quarters, behind boxes of correspondence and old photographs, they found a trunk. It was old, covered in dust with brass fittings that had turned green with age. Camilla stared at it, confused. She had never seen it before. The official's hands trembled slightly as he opened the latch. The hinges creaked, breaking the heavy silence in the room. Inside, wrapped in faded velvet cloth, were objects that seemed to glow even in the dim light. A tiara with diamonds that caught every ray of sun filtering through the window. A necklace of pearls so lustrous they seemed alive. Brooches, rings, and bracelets that spoke of centuries past. Camilla stepped closer, her breath catching. One of the assistants pulled out a small leather journal from beneath the jewels. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting delicate and faded. As he carefully turned the pages, a name appeared again and again. Queen Alexandra. The official looked up at Camilla, his expression transformed from suspicion to astonishment. These were not just any royal jewels. These were pieces that had belonged to Queen Alexandra, wife of King Edward VII, who had died in 1925. They had been listed as missing for nearly a century. The royal collection had records of these items. They appeared in photographs from the early 1900s, adorning Queen Alexandra at state functions and royal gatherings. But after her death, they had vanished. Historians had written about them. Speculators had theorized about their fate, but no one had found them. Until now. Camilla sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed. How had they ended up in her storage room? She had never placed them there. The trunk itself seemed ancient, as if it had been hidden away long before she ever set foot in Clarence House. The official made phone calls. Within an hour, experts from the Royal Collection arrived. They handled the pieces with reverence, their faces showing the kind of excitement archaeologists display when uncovering lost treasures. Each item was examined, photographed from every angle, and carefully documented. A gemologist confirmed that the diamonds in the tiara were consistent with stones sourced in the late Victorian era. The pearls in the necklace matched descriptions from Queen Alexandra's personal inventory. Even the craftsmanship of the settings pointed to jewelers who had worked for the royal family over 100 years ago, but questions remained. How had the trunk stayed hidden for so long? Clarence House had been thoroughly examined multiple times over the decades. It had served various members of the royal family, had been renovated, updated, and searched countless times. Yet this trunk had remained undiscovered. An elderly palace historian was summoned. He arrived in the afternoon, moving slowly but with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He examined the storage room, running his hands along the walls, tapping on panels. Then he found it, a false wall, so cleverly constructed that it appeared to be part of the original architecture. The trunk had been placed in a small cavity behind this wall. Over time, Boxes and furniture had been stacked against it, further concealing the entrance. When Camilla's belongings were moved into Clarence's house years ago, no one had noticed the subtle irregularity in the wall's construction. The historian speculated that someone, perhaps a loyal servant or even a family member, had hidden the jewels during a time of uncertainty. The early 20th century had seen wars, social upheaval, and fears about the monarchy's stability. Perhaps someone had wanted to protect these treasures, intending to retrieve them later, but never getting the chance. As evening fell, Camilla found herself alone again in her quarters. The trunk and its contents had been carefully removed, taken to secure vaults where they would be properly preserved and studied. But the journal remained on her desk. The officials had allowed her to look through it, supervised, before it too would be archived. She opened it carefully. Queen Alexandra's words filled the pages. Entries about her children, her duties, her hopes and fears. There were sketches of jewelry designs, notes about which pieces she planned to wear to which events. And there, near the end, a passage that made Camilla's eyes water. Queen Alexandra had written about the weight of duty, about the loneliness that sometimes accompanied royal life, about the treasures that mattered most. She had not been writing about jewels, but about love, family, and the quiet moments of humanity that existed behind the palace walls. Camilla closed the journal gently. She understood now, in a way she had not before, that she was part of something much larger than herself. These heirlooms represented more than wealth or status. They were connections to women who had walked these same halls, faced similar challenges, and found their own ways to navigate the impossible expectations placed upon them. The discovery would make headlines, she knew. Experts would analyze every facet, every pearl, every word in that journal. But for now, in this quiet moment, Camilla felt a strange kinship with a queen who had lived and loved a century before her. The knock at the door startled her. It was Charles, concern etched on his face. He had heard about the day's events and had come as soon as his duties allowed. She stood and walked to him, finding comfort in his familiar presence. Together, they would face whatever came next, just as those who came before them had done. The news spread through the palace like wildfire. By the next morning, every member of the royal household knew about the discovery. Staff members who had worked at Clarence's house for decades were baffled. Some felt embarrassed that such treasures had been hidden under their noses. Others were simply amazed. Camilla woke early, knowing that the day would bring more questions, more scrutiny, and more attention than she wanted. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant outfit. Today was not about fashion or appearance. It was about facing whatever investigation would come. The officials returned, this time with a larger team. They brought equipment to examine the walls throughout Clarence's house. If one hiding spot had remained secret for so long, there might be others. Camilla agreed to the expanded search, though it meant disrupting her entire household. They worked systematically, room by room. Modern scanning technology revealed the bones of the old building, showing where walls had been added, removed, or modified over the centuries. The house had its secrets, built up in layers like geological strata, each renovation leaving its mark. In what had once been a servant's quarters, now converted to storage, they found another hollow space. This one contained not jewels but documents, letters actually, bundled with ribbon that had faded from red to pale pink. The paper was fragile, requiring careful handling. The letters were correspondence between Queen Alexandra and her sister Dagmar, who had become Empress of Russia. They wrote to each other frequently, sharing news of their families, their worries, and their joys. Some letters spoke of politics, others of simple domestic matters. They revealed a side of Queen Alexandra that history books had barely touched upon. Reading through them, with translation help for the occasional passage in Danish or Russian, painted a picture of a woman who was deeply thoughtful. She worried about her children, especially her son who would become King George V. She fretted about the rising tensions in Europe that would eventually lead to the First World War. She wrote about her charities, her gardens, and the small rebellions she managed within the constraints of royal protocol. One letter, dated 1910, mentioned the jewels specifically. Queen Alexandra wrote that she was setting aside certain pieces for safekeeping. She did not trust the political climate and feared that difficult times lay ahead. She mentioned a trusted confidant, a lady-in-waiting named Margaret Thornton, who would help secure the items. The historians immediately began researching Margaret Thornton. Records showed she had served Queen Alexandra faithfully for over 30 years. She had never married, dedicating her life to royal service. She had died in 1926, just a year after Queen Alexandra, and was buried in a small churchyard in Hampshire. A team was sent to examine any records associated with Margaret Thornton. Her will was simple, leaving her modest savings to a niece. There was no mention of royal property or hidden treasures. If she had been the one to hide the trunk, she had taken that secret to her grave. Meanwhile, at Clarence House, the search continued. In the library, behind a bookshelf that appeared to be built into the wall, they found another small compartment. This one held more personal items: a baby's christening gown, yellowed with age but exquisitely embroidered, a pair of tiny leather shoes, a lock of golden hair tied with a silk ribbon. These items were not valuable in monetary terms, but their emotional weight was immense. They had belonged to Prince John, Queen Alexandra's grandson, who had suffered from epilepsy and learning difficulties. He had been kept away from public view, as was the cruel custom of that era, and had died at age 13 in 1919. Queen Alexandra had adored the boy. The hidden items suggested she had kept mementos of him, treasuring them privately in a time when such sentiment might have been seen as weakness or inappropriate attachment to a child considered imperfect. Camilla found herself deeply moved by these discoveries. Each hidden cache revealed not just historical artifacts, but human stories. These were not the grand narratives of state dinners and official portraits. These were the private sorrows, the quiet loves, the secret acts of preservation that women of the royal family had engaged in when they thought no one was watching. The media, of course, had gotten wind of the story. Reporters camped outside Clarence House, their cameras ready to capture any movement. Headlines screamed about lost treasures and mysterious discoveries. Some publications suggested scandal, hinting at theft or impropriety, though they had no evidence. The palace released a careful statement. The items had been discovered during a routine audit. They were being authenticated and would be added to the royal collection. There was no suggestion of wrongdoing by anyone, past or present. The statement was dignified and brief, revealing nothing of the emotional complexity behind the discovery. But inside the palace walls, discussions were intense. What should be done with these items? The jewels would certainly be displayed eventually, adding to the public's understanding of royal history. But what about the letters? The personal mementos? Did the public have a right to every private thought and feeling of long-dead royals? Camilla argued for discretion. She felt that some things should remain private, that Queen Alexandra deserved to have some secrets kept. Others disagreed, saying that history belonged to everyone, that these documents provided valuable insight into a crucial period. A compromise was reached. The letters would be archived and made available to serious historians and researchers, but they would not be sensationalized or published for mass consumption. The personal items related to Prince John would be handled with special care, perhaps included in a thoughtful exhibition about how attitudes toward disability had evolved. As for the jewels, plans were already underway for their restoration. The tiara, in particular, would require careful work. Some of the diamonds had loosened in their settings. The metal needed cleaning and reinforcement. But when complete, it would be spectacular. The royal collection curators were already discussing which pieces might be worn again. There was precedent for this. Royal jewels were not meant to sit in vaults forever. They were meant to be worn, to sparkle at state occasions, to connect past and present. The question was raised delicately. Would Camilla herself wear any of these pieces? It seemed fitting in a way. She was the one in whose residence they had been found. She was the one who had inadvertently brought them back into the light. Camilla considered this carefully. Part of her wanted to say no, feeling it would be presumptuous. These had been Queen Alexandra's jewels. They carried her history, her energy, her story. But another part of her recognized the symbolism. Wearing them would be a way of honoring the past while moving forward, of acknowledging the unbroken line of women who had held this position. She requested time to think about it. In the meantime, there was work to be done. The audit had expanded to other royal residences. If Clarence House had held secrets for a century, What might be hidden elsewhere? The search was delicate, respectful, but thorough. At Buckingham Palace, in rooms that had been servants' quarters in Victorian times, they found a hidden drawer in what appeared to be an ordinary cabinet. Inside were dance cards from balls held in the 1800s, each one carefully preserved, the tiny pencil notations still legible. Someone had treasured these memories of music and movement, of evenings when duty gave way to joy. The discoveries continued, each one a small window into lives lived under extraordinary circumstances. And with each find, Camilla felt her connection to this history deepen. She was not just a woman who had married into royalty. She was part of a continuum, a link in a chain that stretched backward and forward through time. 3 weeks had passed since the initial discovery, and Clarence House had returned to something resembling normal routine. The searches had concluded, the experts had finished their preliminary examinations, and the hidden treasures were now safely catalogued in the royal collection vaults. But for Camilla, everything had changed. She found herself thinking about Queen Alexandra constantly. Late at night, when sleep would not come, she would imagine the older woman walking these same corridors, dealing with her own challenges and heartbreaks. The connection felt personal, almost intimate, as if Alexandra's spirit had reached across time to share her story. The head curator of the royal collection, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, requested a private meeting. She arrived at Clarence House carrying a portfolio of photographs and documents. Camilla received her in the morning room, where spring sunlight made the space feel warm and welcoming. Dr. Hartwell laid out the photographs carefully. They showed Queen Alexandra wearing various pieces from the discovered collection. There she was at a state banquet in 1902, the diamond tiara catching the light of 1,000 candles. Here she stood with King Edward VII, the pearl necklace draped elegantly around her neck. Another image showed her at a garden party, a delicate brooch pinned to her dress. The curator explained that they had been able to match almost every piece from the trunk to historical photographs. This confirmation of authenticity made the discovery even more significant. These were not just beautiful objects. They were documented pieces of history, items that had been mourned as lost for generations. But Dr. Hartwell had come with a specific purpose. She wanted to discuss the possibility of an exhibition. The Royal Collection Trust was planning a special display about Queen Alexandra, and these newly discovered pieces would be the centerpiece. They wanted Camilla's input, and more than that, they wanted her involvement. Camilla listened carefully as the curator outlined her vision. The exhibition would not just be about jewels and treasures. It would tell Queen Alexandra's story, her role as a fashion icon, her charitable work, her personal struggles. The hidden items would be presented in context, showing why someone might have felt compelled to hide them and what their rediscovery meant today. The idea appealed to Camilla. It felt right to honor Alexandra properly, to tell her story beyond the surface-level history that most people knew. She agreed to be part of the planning process and to attend the opening of the exhibition when the time came. As Dr. Hartwell gathered her materials to leave, she mentioned something that made Camilla pause. There was one piece from the collection that had particularly captured the public's imagination. It was a relatively simple brooch, a cameo set in gold with small diamonds surrounding it. The cameo showed a profile of a woman, and on the back was an inscription, "To A with eternal devotion, E." Edward VII had given it to Alexandra early in their marriage. Despite his many well-documented affairs, this piece suggested a genuine affection between them. It was not the most expensive item in the collection, but it carried the most emotional weight. People were fascinated by this glimpse of real feeling in what was often portrayed as merely a dynastic arrangement. After the curator left, Camilla sat alone with her thoughts. She understood that fascination. Her own journey to this position had been complicated, marked by public scrutiny and harsh judgment. She knew what it was like to love someone when the world questioned that love. The brooch felt like a message from Alexandra, a reminder that behind every royal story was a real human heart. The following week brought an unexpected visitor. Margaret Thornton's great-niece, a woman named Diana Patterson, had read about the discoveries in the newspapers. She was elderly herself now, in her 80s, but sharp and energetic. She had information she thought might be relevant. Diana arrived with a small wooden box. Inside were her great-aunt's personal papers, items that had been passed down through the family but never properly examined. There were letters, diary entries, and photographs. Diana had gone through them after reading about the discovery and had found something remarkable. Margaret Thornton had kept a private journal. In it, she had written about her service to Queen Alexandra in careful, measured prose. But there was one entry, dated December 1925, just weeks before the Queen's death, that told the story Camilla needed to hear. Queen Alexandra had known she was dying. She had called Margaret to her and given her specific instructions. Certain items were to be hidden away, not for monetary value, but for emotional protection. Alexandra did not want them divided up among relatives who might not appreciate their significance. She did not want them sold or lost. She wanted them preserved, hidden safely, until a time when they might be discovered and properly valued. Margaret had followed these instructions faithfully. She had worked with a trusted carpenter to create the false wall, had placed the trunk carefully, and had taken the secret to her grave. She had not told even her family, honoring her queen's final wishes. Diana Patterson had tears in her eyes as she shared this information. She felt proud of her great-aunt, proud that Margaret had been trusted with such an important task. She wanted everyone to know that this had not been theft or conspiracy, but an act of love and loyalty. Camilla was deeply moved. She asked Diana if she would be willing to share this journal with the royal collection, to let Margaret's story be told alongside Alexandra's. Diana agreed immediately. She said her great-aunt would have been honored to have her role in history recognized. The discovery of Margaret's journal changed the narrative entirely. News outlets that had been hinting at scandal now wrote about devotion and loyalty. The story became one of female friendship, and the bonds that transcended class in service to a higher purpose. Margaret Thornton, who had lived and died in relative obscurity, was suddenly being celebrated as a faithful guardian of royal history. For Camilla, the journal provided a sense of closure. The mystery was solved. The items had been hidden with love and intention, not abandoned or forgotten. Queen Alexandra had trusted Margaret with her most precious possessions, and Margaret had honored that trust perfectly. But one question remained unanswered. Why had Queen Alexandra hidden these specific items? Why not leave them to her children or donate them to the royal collection while she was alive? What was she protecting them from? The answer came from an unexpected source. A historian studying the political climate of 1920s Britain pointed out that the monarchy had been under significant pressure. The Russian Revolution had executed Alexandra's sister's family. Other European monarchies were falling. There were serious questions about whether the British royal family would survive. In that context, Alexandra's decision made sense. She was protecting not just objects but symbols. If the monarchy fell, these items might have been confiscated, sold, or destroyed. By hiding them, she was preserving a piece of royal history for a future she hoped would be more stable. It was an act of faith, really. Faith that the monarchy would endure, that someday these items would be found and appreciated, that her story would matter to future generations. And she had been right. The monarchy had survived, adapted, and continued. And now, a century later, her treasures had indeed been found. Camilla shared this interpretation with Charles during a quiet dinner together. He listened thoughtfully, his historian's mind engaging with the ideas. He noted that his great-great-grandmother had shown remarkable foresight. She had understood that preserving history required more than just physical objects. It required the right context, the right moment for revelation. They discussed what this meant for them, for the modern monarchy. The world was different now, but some challenges remained the same. The need to balance public service with private humanity, the pressure to be symbols while remaining human, the weight of history, and the uncertainty of the future. As they talked, Camilla realized that the discovery of Queen Alexandra's heirlooms had given her something precious. Not just beautiful objects, but perspective. She was part of something larger than herself, part of a story that would continue long after she was gone. That thought was both humbling and strangely comforting. The restoration work on Queen Alexandra's jewels had begun in earnest. Master craftsmen who specialized in historic pieces were brought in to assess each item. The tiara required the most delicate work. Over the decades, some diamonds had shifted in their settings, and the metal framework had weakened. but the craftsmen were confident they could restore it to its original glory without compromising its historical integrity. Camilla was invited to observe the restoration process. She arrived at the Royal Collection workshop on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by minimal security. The workshop was a place few outside the royal household ever saw, a space where history was carefully preserved and sometimes resurrected. The head jeweler, a man named Thomas Crawford, who had worked for the Royal Collection for 30 years, guided her through the process. He showed her how they documented every aspect of each piece before beginning any work. Photographs from multiple angles, measurements, notes about the condition of every stone and every bit of metalwork. Thomas explained that restoration was as much archaeology as craftsmanship. Every scratch, every sign of wear told a story. The tiara showed evidence of having been worn many times. There were tiny marks where it had rested against Alexandra's hair, minuscule scratches from decades of handling. These marks would be preserved where possible. They were part of the piece's history. As Thomas worked under a bright magnifying light, removing a diamond from its setting to examine it more closely, he told Camilla about the original craftsmen who had made these pieces. They had been masters of their trade, working in an era when every jewel for royalty was unique, made by hand, never mass-produced. The techniques they had used were almost lost arts now. The way they had set certain stones, the intricate metalwork that held everything together, the attention to detail that ensured these pieces could be worn comfortably despite their weight and complexity. Modern jewelers could replicate these techniques, but few did anymore. It was not economically viable for most work. Camilla watched in fascination as Thomas carefully cleaned a pearl from the necklace. He used nothing but soft brushes and distilled water, treating the pearl as if it were alive and fragile, which in a sense it was. Pearls were organic gems, he explained, and they required different care than diamonds or rubies. These particular pearls had maintained their luster remarkably well, protected by the velvet wrapping and the sealed environment of the hidden trunk. Some historic pearls developed a chalky appearance over time, but these still glowed with inner light. They had likely been some of the finest pearls available in their era, sourced from natural pearl beds that were now largely depleted. The pearl necklace had another secret. Between several of the pearls, Thomas found tiny inscriptions in the gold spacers that separated them. They were so small that they could only be read under magnification, and they had gone unnoticed in the initial examination. The inscriptions were dates, marking significant moments in Queen Alexandra's life: the day she married Edward, the birth dates of her children, the day of Edward's coronation. This discovery was thrilling. It suggested that the necklace was not just beautiful jewelry but a kind of personal timeline, a wearable chronicle of Alexandra's most important moments. Thomas documented each inscription carefully, and historians began researching the dates to understand their full significance. One date, however, puzzled everyone. It did not correspond to any known event in Queen Alexandra's public life. Researchers combed through historical records trying to find what might have happened on that particular day in 1871. Finally, a junior researcher found a reference in a private letter collection. It was the date Alexandra had first met Queen Victoria's youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, who would become one of her closest friends. The personal nature of this inclusion was touching. Among dates marking official milestones, Alexandra had chosen to immortalize a moment of personal connection, a friendship that had clearly mattered deeply to her. It humanized her in a way that official histories never had. As the restoration work continued over the following weeks, other discoveries emerged. The brooch with the cameo contained a tiny compartment behind the portrait, so cleverly hidden that it had escaped notice for over a century. Inside was a lock of hair, brown and still surprisingly intact, tied with a thread of gold. DNA analysis would have been possible, but there was debate about whether it was appropriate. Some argued that such analysis was invasive, disturbing something Alexandra had clearly meant to keep private. Others felt that confirming whose hair it was would add to the historical record. Eventually, it was decided to leave the lock undisturbed. Some mysteries could remain mysteries. Camilla found herself increasingly involved in decisions about the collection. Her initial reluctance had given way to a sense of responsibility. These items had been found in her home under her watch. She felt a duty to ensure they were treated with respect and sensitivity. She worked closely with Dr. Hartwell to develop the exhibition plan. They decided it would be held at Windsor Castle, in rooms that Queen Alexandra herself would have known. The exhibition would run for 6 months, giving people from around the world a chance to see these remarkable pieces. But they wanted it to be more than just a display of wealth. They planned to include the journal pages, Margaret Thornton's diary entries, and photographs showing Alexandra wearing these pieces. There would be information about the social and political context of her era, about the roles and restrictions women faced, about how Alexandra had navigated her position with grace and quiet strength. The exhibition would also address the more difficult aspects of that history. Alexandra's deaf son, Prince John's story, the tensions in her marriage, the losses she had endured. Real history was not sanitized or simple. It included pain alongside beauty, failure alongside triumph. One afternoon, as Camilla was reviewing exhibition plans, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from a woman in Denmark, a distant relative of Queen Alexandra's sister. She had heard about the discoveries and wanted to share something her family had preserved. The woman, whose name was Ingrid, explained that her family had letters written by Alexandra to her sister that had never been published or archived. They were private correspondence written in Danish that covered the same period when Alexandra had been hiding the jewels. Ingrid's family had always treasured these letters but had kept them private out of respect. Now, however, Ingrid felt the time was right to share them. She believed they would provide context for the exhibition, showing Alexandra's state of mind during those turbulent years. She was not asking for money or recognition. She simply wanted to contribute to a fuller understanding of a woman her family had always revered. Arrangements were made for the letters to be professionally photographed and translated. When the translations arrived, they revealed Alexandra writing candidly about her fears for the future, her determination to protect what mattered most, and her trust in Margaret Thornton. One letter explicitly mentioned the plan to hide certain items, confirming what Margaret's diary had already indicated. But the letters also showed Alexandra's wit, her observations about the changing world around her, and her unexpected hopefulness. Despite all her worries, she believed that the core values she held dear would endure. She wrote about duty, certainly, but also about love, kindness, and the importance of small acts of grace in a world that often seemed harsh. These letters would be included in the exhibition, with Ingrid's family credited and thanked. It was another piece of the puzzle falling into place, another voice from the past adding depth to the story being told. As preparations for the exhibition intensified, Camilla made a decision. She would wear the tiara at a state banquet scheduled for later that year. It would be the first time any of Queen Alexandra's lost jewels would be worn in public since their rediscovery. The symbolism was not lost on anyone involved in the planning. There was nervousness about this decision. The tiara was priceless, both in monetary and historical terms. Security would have to be extraordinary. Insurance was complicated, and there was always the risk that something might go wrong, that the piece might be damaged despite all precautions. But Camilla felt it was important. These jewels had not been made to sit behind glass forever. They had been created to be worn, to sparkle at important occasions, to represent the continuity and dignity of the institution they served. Wearing the tiara would honor Alexandra's memory and bring her story back to life in a tangible way. The announcement that Camilla would wear Queen Alexandra's tiara at the upcoming state banquet created unprecedented public interest. Royal watchers around the world marked their calendars. Fashion magazines devoted pages to analyzing what the choice meant. Historians were interviewed about the significance of bringing these jewels back into active use. But behind the scenes, preparations were intense. The tiara needed to be fitted specifically to Camilla. Unlike modern jewelry that could be adjusted easily, historic pieces required expert handling. The royal hairdresser worked with the jeweler to determine exactly how the tiara would be positioned, how Camilla's hair would be styled to support it, and how to ensure both comfort and security. Camilla attended several fittings. She sat patiently while adjustments were discussed and tested. The weight of the tiara was considerable, and it needed to be balanced properly. Too far forward and it would press uncomfortably on her forehead. Too far back and it might slip. The positioning had to be perfect. During one of these fittings, a photographer from the royal collection was present to document the process. Camilla saw herself in the mirror wearing the tiara for the first time, and the moment took her breath away. It was not vanity that moved her, but the sense of connection. She was looking at herself, but she was also seeing Alexandra, seeing all the women who had worn these jewels over the decades they had been in use. The photographer captured that moment, and the image would later become one of the most shared photographs of the entire discovery story. There was something in Camilla's expression, a mix of awe and responsibility that resonated with people. It showed a woman understanding the weight of history, not just as metaphor but as physical reality resting on her head. As the state banquet approached, other preparations intensified. The guest list was carefully planned, including diplomats, government officials, and select members of the public who had contributed to various charitable causes. The menu was designed to showcase British cuisine at its finest. Every detail was considered and reconsidered. Security arrangements were extraordinary. The tiara would be transported from the royal collection vaults to the palace in an armored vehicle. It would be under guard until the moment Camilla put it on. After the banquet, it would be immediately returned to secure storage. Nothing could be left to chance. The day of the banquet arrived. Camilla woke early despite the event being hours away. She felt nervous in a way she had not anticipated. This was not just about looking appropriate at a formal event. This was about honoring Alexandra's memory, about proving worthy of wearing such a significant piece. She spent the morning quietly, avoiding the usual meetings and correspondence that filled her days. She needed time to center herself, to prepare mentally for what the evening would mean. Charles checked on her several times, offering support and reassurance. He understood what this meant to her, even if he could not fully share the emotional complexity of it. The preparation process began in the late afternoon. Her lady's maid helped her into the gown that had been chosen for the occasion, a deep blue dress that would complement the diamonds without competing with them. The fabric was sumptuous, falling in elegant lines that recalled the silhouette of Alexandra's era while remaining thoroughly modern. The hairdresser arrived next, working with precision to create a style that would properly support the tiara, every pin placed, every strand positioned with care. This was not ordinary styling. This was engineering disguised as beauty. Finally, the moment came to place the tiara. The head jeweler brought it in personally, carrying it on a velvet cushion as if it were a sacred relic. The room fell silent as he approached. Even the staff members present, people who dealt with royal regalia regularly, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The jeweler positioned the tiara carefully, working with the hairdresser to ensure it was secure. They stepped back, examining their work from every angle. Then they both nodded. It was perfect. Camilla looked at herself in the mirror. The diamonds caught the light from every direction, creating a constellation of sparkles that seemed almost alive. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Even after a century, even after being hidden away in the dark, the tiara performed exactly as its makers had intended. But more than the beauty, Camilla felt the presence of history. She thought about Alexandra wearing this same piece, standing before different mirrors in different times. She thought about Margaret Thornton carefully wrapping it in velvet, hiding it away with tears in her eyes. She thought about all the years it had waited in darkness, patient and enduring. Charles came to escort her down to the banquet. When he saw her, he stopped, momentarily speechless. Then he smiled, that warm smile she knew so well, and offered his arm. Together they walked through the corridors of the palace, their footsteps echoing on marble floors, moving toward the great hall where their guests awaited. The banquet hall was magnificent. Chandeliers blazed with light. The table settings gleamed. Flowers from the royal gardens provided splashes of color. As Camilla entered on Charles's arm, a murmur ran through the assembled guests. Every eye was drawn to the tiara. Throughout the dinner, Camilla was aware of the weight on her head, but it was not uncomfortable. If anything, it grounded her, reminded her to sit tall, to move with grace and deliberation. She understood now why posture had been so important to women of earlier eras. When wearing such a piece, careless movement was impossible. The conversation flowed easily. Diplomats discussed international relations. Artists talked about their work. The carefully planned seating arrangement ensured interesting dialogue at every part of the long table. But underlying every conversation was awareness of the tiara, of what it represented, of the history that had been revived this evening. During dessert, Charles stood to give a toast. He spoke about continuity and change, about how institutions endured by honoring their past while embracing their future. He mentioned Queen Alexandra, praising her dedication and grace. He thanked everyone involved in the discovery and preservation of the lost treasures. And he acknowledged Camilla, her role in bringing these pieces back to light, literally and figuratively. Camilla felt emotion welling up, but maintained her composure. This was not the time for tears. This was a celebration, a moment of triumph over time and uncertainty. The guests raised their glasses, the crystal chiming together like small bells. After the banquet, as protocol required, Camilla remained for a reception. More guests arrived, people who had been invited for the post-dinner gathering. She moved through the room, speaking with each person, listening to their thoughts about the exhibition, about the discovery, about the significance of seeing historic jewels worn again. One elderly woman, a renowned historian, took Camilla's hand and said something that would stay with her forever. The woman said that by wearing the tiara, Camilla had completed a circle. Alexandra had hidden the jewels hoping they would be found and valued. Now they had been found, and here they were, not locked away but alive again, serving their purpose, telling their story. Finally, late in the evening, the formal events concluded. Camilla returned to her private quarters where the jeweler waited to carefully remove the tiara. As he lifted it from her head, she felt the lightness of its absence, the relief of setting down that beautiful burden. The jeweler placed it back on its cushion, and security immediately began the process of returning it to the vaults. Camilla watched it go, this piece of history that she had briefly been privileged to carry. She knew that photographs and videos from the evening would circulate for years. The image of her wearing Alexandra's tiara would become part of the visual history of the monarchy. But for Camilla, the most important part had been the feeling of connection. For those few hours, she had literally carried the weight of the past. She had honored Alexandra's memory in the most direct way possible. And she had demonstrated that history was not just something to be preserved behind glass. It was something living, something that could still sparkle and shine when brought back into the light. As she prepared for bed, still wearing the blue gown because she was too tired to change immediately, Camilla thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the initial shock of the audit to tonight's triumph, it had been a transformation. She had gone from feeling like an outsider to understanding her place in this long story. The photographs from the state banquet dominated newspapers and websites for days. Fashion critics praised Camilla's styling. Historians analyzed the significance. Social media exploded with commentary, most of it remarkably positive. People seemed to appreciate the story behind the tiara, the journey from hidden trunk to glittering return. But the attention also brought challenges. The royal collection was overwhelmed with requests for information. Schools wanted to bring students to learn about the discovery. Documentary filmmakers sought access. Authors proposed books. The staff worked overtime trying to respond to everyone while also preparing for the exhibition opening. Now just weeks away, Camilla found herself in demand for interviews, something she usually approached with caution. But Dr. Hartwell convinced her that speaking about the discovery would help people understand its significance. They arranged a carefully structured interview with a respected journalist known for thoughtful royal coverage. The interview took place at Clarence House, in the very room where the trunk had been discovered. Camilla spoke honestly about her initial confusion and shock, about learning Alexandra's story, about how the experience had changed her perspective on her role. The journalist asked intelligent questions, avoiding sensation in favor of substance. When the interview was published, it struck a chord. People appreciated Camilla's candor, her obvious respect for history, her humility in discussing her connection to these treasures. Comment sections filled with supportive messages. Even critics who had never warmed to her seemed to soften, recognizing the genuine emotion in her words. The exhibition opening was scheduled for a Thursday in June. The weather cooperated, providing a perfect late spring day. Windsor Castle's grounds were immaculate, the ancient stones warm in the sunshine. Guests began arriving in the morning, a mixture of dignitaries, historians, descendants of people connected to Queen Alexandra, and representatives from various organizations. Margaret Thornton's great-niece, Diana Patterson was given a place of honor. At 83, she moved slowly but with dignity. She wore a brooch that had belonged to her great-aunt, a simple piece but precious to her family. When she arrived, Camilla greeted her personally, thanking her again for sharing Margaret's journal. Ingrid, the Danish relative who had contributed Alexandra's letters, had flown in from Copenhagen. She brought her teenage granddaughter, wanting the girl to understand their family's connection to this history. The granddaughter was initially skeptical, viewing it as another boring family obligation, but her attitude changed when she saw the actual jewels displayed. The exhibition had been designed with care and creativity. Visitors entered through a corridor lined with photographs of Queen Alexandra at various stages of her life. From beautiful young bride to dignified elderly queen, the images showed her evolution. Quotes from her letters were displayed alongside the photos, giving insight into her thoughts and feelings. The main exhibition hall was breathtaking. The jewels were displayed in specially designed cases with perfect lighting that made every diamond, every pearl, every colored stone come alive. But the cases also included context. Next to the tiara was a photograph of Alexandra wearing it, along with information about when and where it had been worn. The brooch with the cameo had its own small display, with Edward VII's inscription translated and explained. Visitors could read about the complex relationship between Edward and Alexandra, about his affairs and her quiet dignity, about the genuine affection that seemed to exist alongside the difficulties. The letters were displayed under UV-protected glass, with translations provided. Visitors could read Alexandra's own words describing her decision to hide these items, her fears about the future, her hope that they would someday be found and appreciated. The authenticity of her voice made the story real in a way that no historical analysis could match. Margaret Thornton's journal entries were also included, showing her perspective on the hiding of the treasures. The exhibition made clear that this was not just Alexandra's story but also Margaret's, a tale of female friendship and loyalty that transcended class boundaries. One room was dedicated to Prince John, the grandson whose mementos had been found hidden. This section was handled with particular sensitivity. It acknowledged the cruel attitudes toward disability in that era, while celebrating Alexandra's love for the boy. Modern visitors could see how far society had progressed, while also recognizing the universal nature of a grandmother's love. Interactive elements allowed visitors to see how the jewels had been made, with videos showing modern craftsmen using historic techniques. Children could try on replica tiaras, experiencing the weight and balance involved. There were touchscreens with additional photographs and information for those who wanted to dive deeper into the history. The official opening ceremony began at noon. Charles and Camilla were there, of course, along with other members of the royal family. Dr. Hartwell gave a speech outlining the discovery and its significance. Diana Patterson was invited to say a few words about her great-aunt, which she did with quiet pride. Then Camilla spoke. She talked about the moment of discovery, about learning Alexandra's story, about the sense of connection she had felt. She thanked everyone who had contributed to making the exhibition possible. She expressed hope that visitors would see not just beautiful objects but human stories, the private lives behind the public roles. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a portrait. A contemporary artist had been commissioned to paint Queen Alexandra, wearing the recovered tiara, based on historical photographs but executed in a modern style. The painting hung in the exhibition's final room, a bridge between past and present. After the formal opening, guests toured the exhibition. Camilla moved through the rooms observing people's reactions. She saw children's eyes widen at the sparkle of diamonds. She watched historians carefully reading every placard, taking notes. She noticed visitors taking photographs, capturing moments they wanted to remember. In one corner, she found an elderly man standing before the display of Alexandra's letters, tears streaming down his face. She approached gently, asking if he was all right. He explained that his grandmother had been a servant at the palace during Alexandra's time. She had spoken about the queen with such reverence, describing her kindness and grace. Seeing this exhibition, reading Alexandra's own words, made his grandmother's stories real again. Camilla spent several minutes talking with him, listening to his memories of his grandmother's stories. These were the moments that made all the work worthwhile, she realized. The exhibition was not just about preserving objects. It was about preserving and sharing human experience, connecting generations through story. As afternoon faded toward evening, the crowds thinned slightly. Camilla found herself back in the main hall, standing before the tiara she had worn at the state banquet. Seeing it in the case beautifully lit and displayed, she felt a sense of completion. The journey from hidden trunk to this moment had been remarkable. Dr. Hartwell joined her, and they stood together in companionable silence for a moment. Then the curator mentioned that advance bookings for the exhibition had exceeded all expectations. They would need to extend hours and add additional viewing times. People were traveling from around the world to see this display. The response had been overwhelming in the best way. Museums in other countries were requesting permission to host traveling versions of the exhibition. Publishers wanted to create books documenting the discovery and display. The story had captured imaginations globally, but for Camilla, the most meaningful responses came from ordinary people. Letters arrived at Clarence House from individuals who had been touched by the story. A woman wrote about finding her grandmother's hidden letters and treasuring them anew. A man described visiting the exhibition with his daughter and talking about the importance of preserving family history. A teacher explained how she was using the story in her classroom to teach about history, loyalty, and the passage of time. These letters showed that the discovery had resonated beyond royal circles, beyond history enthusiasts. It had touched something universal, the human need to connect with the past, to understand where we come from, to preserve what matters for future generations. As the opening day concluded, Camilla was exhausted but satisfied. The exhibition would run for 6 months, giving hundreds of thousands of people the opportunity to see these treasures and learn their story. After that, decisions would be made about what came next, how these pieces would be used and displayed in the future. But that was for later. For now, standing in this space that honored Queen Alexandra and Margaret Thornton, and all the hidden stories of women who had served the crown in various ways, Camilla felt at peace. She had helped bring something beautiful back to light, and in doing so had found her own place in the continuing story. 6 months passed in what felt like a blink. The exhibition at Windsor Castle had been an overwhelming success, welcoming over 400,000 visitors. People had traveled from every corner of the globe to see Queen Alexandra's recovered treasures. The guest book was filled with comments in dozens of languages, all expressing wonder and gratitude. Now, as the exhibition prepared to close, decisions needed to be made about the future of these pieces. The Royal Collection Trust called a meeting, bringing together curators, historians, and senior members of the royal household. Camilla attended, her input now considered essential given her unique connection to the discovery. Dr. Hartwell presented several options. Some pieces could be integrated into the permanent royal collection displays at various palaces. Others might be loaned to museums for specific exhibitions. The tiara and several other pieces could potentially be designated for use at state occasions, continuing the tradition of wearing historic jewels. The discussion was thoughtful and sometimes heated. Some argued that these pieces were too fragile and valuable to be worn regularly. Others insisted that jewelry made to be worn should not be permanently retired. There were concerns about insurance, security, and the responsibility of allowing these items back into active use. Camilla listened carefully to all perspectives. When asked for her opinion, she spoke about her experience wearing the tiara. She described the sense of connection it had created, how it had made history tangible not just for her but for everyone who had seen the photographs. She argued that occasional careful use would honor the item's original purpose while also keeping them relevant. A compromise emerged. The tiara would be available for major state occasions, worn perhaps once or twice a year. Other pieces would be displayed in permanent exhibitions, but could be loaned to museums for special shows. The more fragile items would be kept in climate-controlled storage, brought out only for specific displays. The brooch with the cameo would have a special role. It would become part of a new education program aimed at school children. Replica brooches would be created, and students learning about Victorian and Edwardian history would receive these replicas, along with materials telling Alexandra's story. The original would tour schools in a secure display, giving children outside major cities a chance to see real royal history. This plan pleased everyone. It balanced preservation with accessibility, honoring the past while thinking about future generations. The meeting concluded with assignments given, timelines established, and a sense of purpose about moving forward. But there was one more surprise to come. A week after the meeting, Camilla received a package. It had been sent from a law office in Edinburgh, and it contained items that had been held in trust for decades, only to be released when certain conditions were met. Inside the package was a letter, written by Margaret Thornton years before her death. She had left instructions that this letter should only be delivered if and when Queen Alexandra's hidden items were discovered and publicly acknowledged. The law firm had been monitoring news about the royal family for generations, waiting for this specific event. Margaret's letter was personal and moving. She wrote about her years of service to Queen Alexandra, about the trust that had developed between them. She described the day Alexandra had asked her to hide the treasures, the Queen's hands trembling as she explained her fears and her hopes. But the letter also contained something unexpected. Margaret wrote about a conversation she had with Alexandra shortly before the Queen's death. Alexandra had told her that whoever eventually found these items would need them, not for their monetary value but for what they represented. Alexandra had believed that future members of the royal family would face their own challenges, their own doubts, their own struggles to balance duty with humanity. The treasures were meant to be a message across time. They said that challenges pass, that what seems insurmountable can be overcome, that beauty and grace and dignity could survive even the darkest periods. Alexandra had hidden them not just for safekeeping, but as a gift to the future. Reading this, Camilla found herself crying. She had spent months learning about Alexandra, feeling connected to her across the decades. But this letter made that connection explicit and intentional. Alexandra had literally reached out to her, to whoever would find these items, offering comfort and encouragement. She shared the letter with Charles that evening. He read it silently, his expression thoughtful. When he finished, he looked at Camilla and said that perhaps this was why everything had happened as it did. The timing of the discovery, the public response, the way it had allowed Camilla to find her place and purpose in her role. Maybe Alexandra's gift had worked exactly as intended. The letter would be added to the archives, but Camilla had it photographed first. She wanted a copy for herself, something she could return to when times were difficult. It would be a reminder that she was part of a long line of women who had faced challenges with grace, who had found ways to serve while remaining human. As autumn arrived and life settled back into routine, Camilla reflected on the entire experience. What had begun with an audit, with officials going through her possessions, had transformed into something profound. She had discovered not just lost treasures, but a connection to history that gave meaning to her present. The letters continued to arrive, though less frequently now. People wrote to thank her for sharing the story, for wearing the tiara, for helping make history accessible. Teachers wrote about students who had been inspired by Margaret Thornton's loyalty. Historians wrote about new research directions opened by the recovered letters and documents. There were invitations, too. Museums wanted her to speak at events. Historical societies requested her attendance at conferences. She accepted some, declined others, finding a balance that worked for her schedule and energy. One invitation particularly touched her. The small church in Hampshire where Margaret Thornton was buried wanted to place a new memorial plaque, acknowledging Margaret's role in preserving royal history. They asked if Camilla would attend the dedication ceremony. She agreed without hesitation. On a gray November morning, she traveled to the churchyard with minimal fanfare. Diana Patterson was there, along with other descendants of Margaret's family. Local historians attended, and a few journalists. But it was a relatively small and intimate gathering. The new plaque was simple but elegant. It noted Margaret's years of service to Queen Alexandra and acknowledged her faithful guardianship of historic treasures. The vicar said a few words about duty and loyalty, about how one person's faithfulness could echo across generations. Camilla laid flowers on Margaret's grave, white roses that would have been available in Margaret's time. She stood there for a moment, head bowed, silently thanking this woman she had never met, but whose actions had so profoundly affected her life. After the ceremony, Camilla spoke with Margaret's descendants. They shared family stories, some funny, some sad, all painting a picture of a woman who had been devoted to her work but also had a private life full of small joys. She had loved gardening, apparently, and had been known for her lemon cakes. These human details mattered. They made Margaret real in a way that the historical record alone could not. She was not just a faithful servant in the abstract. She was a person who had made choices, lived a life, cared about things beyond her royal duties. Driving back to London, Camilla thought about legacy. What would people say about her in 100 years? What would they remember? Would her struggles and triumphs matter to future generations? Or would she be just another name in a long list of consorts? The discovery of Alexandra's treasures suggested that the personal did matter, that private moments of grace and strength could resonate across time. Maybe her own life, with all its complications and controversies, would someday be understood more fully, more compassionately. She thought about the tiara, now back in the royal vaults waiting for its next appearance. She thought about Alexandra's letters, preserved and studied, revealing a woman's inner life. She thought about Margaret's loyalty, finally recognized and honored. All these pieces fit together, telling a story about how women had navigated impossible situations with dignity and determination. That evening, in the quiet of Clarence House, Camilla wrote in her own journal. She had started keeping one after reading Alexandra's writings, feeling that her own thoughts and experiences should be preserved. Not for publication, not for historians necessarily, but as a record that she had existed fully, had thought deeply, had cared about things beyond her official role. She wrote about the journey that had begun with that audit, about everything she had learned and felt. She wrote about gratitude for the unexpected gift Alexandra had left, for the way these lost treasures had helped her find something she did not even know she was searching for. A sense of belonging, a connection to history that made her present meaningful, a way to understand her role not as burden but as privilege. She wrote about hope that future generations would judge her kindly, would understand that she had tried her best in difficult circumstances. And she wrote about her wish that someday, perhaps long after she was gone, someone would discover her own hidden treasures, whatever form they might take, and would understand the heart behind them.